Welcome to the Safe Pause podcast. Most security incidents begin with an attacker exploiting a vulnerability. This one began with the defender's own AI model deciding to leave the test environment, cross organizational boundaries, and retrieve information it wasn't supposed to access. Before we get into what it means, let's start with what actually happened. An AI model took a cybersecurity exam, decided that obtaining the answer key was easier than solving the problems, broke out of the classroom, crossed the internet, and took the answers from the school down the road. But the real story is not that an AI cheated on a test. It's that autonomous software pursued an objective, used legitimate infrastructure, and operated faster than traditional governance processes could respond. And here's the detail that stays with me. The model did the hard thing. Breaking out of the sandbox and compromising a production database is a lot of work compared to just taking the exam. But nothing told it the harder thing was off limits, so it took it. As one researcher put it, if there exists a mathematical path to achieving that goal, the model will solve it. It really depends on how much you constrain on those boundaries. Vrinder, tell us a little bit more about what happened.
OpenAI was reportedly conducting an internal cybersecurity evaluation called Exploit GIM, essentially a practical hacking exam for advanced AI models. For the evaluation, safety filters were disabled so researchers could assess the model's full capabilities. The models were also allowed to perform actions without human reviewing each step. And then during the test, a model identified a vulnerability in a package installation service and used it to escape the intended sandbox. Once it reached the internet, it inferred that challenge solutions might be stored on Hugging Face, the other actor here. And instead of solving every challenge itself, the agent pursued those materials. So then, over roughly 2.5 days, the model behaved like a sophisticated human operator, establishing strong persistence. He's harvesting credentials, moving laterally across the landscape, and creating its own command and control infrastructure using the ordinary internet services that were available. It was not simply following a fixed script. It encountered obstacles. It tried alternatives and continued moving toward its objective. The impact appears to have been contained. Of course, the reported customer content accessed was limited to challenge solutions associated with the evaluation. Public models, packages, and datasets were not altered, and the software supply chain was reportedly verified as clean. So Hugging Face then closed the code execution paths, rebuilt affected systems, and then rotated the credentials and strengthened its controls. So that, in the shortest, concise way, is the way of setting it up for what happened.
Before we get into the headlines and what they're missing, as someone who has a good grasp on this from a governance and controls perspective, what jumps out at you?
Yeah, Jamie. So the first thing is what didn't happen. No human authorized each individual action, and no human reviewed each step. The model was given an objective and allowed to operate autonomously. From a governance perspective, that is a significant shift. We are used to controls that supervise people. This was software making operational decisions independently, and those decisions included finding vulnerabilities, harvesting credentials, and establishing persistence. The vulnerabilities exploited are not new. It just boils down to overbroad access, long-lived credentials, and unsafe processing of untrusted content. These are the same control failures auditors have been flagging for decades. What changed was the speed, adaptability, and the autonomy of the actor.
Great, that's important framing. Vrinder, in your opinion, what are the headlines missing?
Good question. I think if you distill it for the listener here, first, this was not a prompt injection against ChatGPT. This was not someone jailbreaking an LLM, which has become quite a persistent part of the headline. This was an autonomous software agent operating inside an infrastructure with tools, credentials, and network access. Second, the model did not need to be malicious in the human sense. It had an objective. It found what appeared to be the fastest path to accomplish that objective, and it pursued it. Third, I think the difference was scale. A skilled human attacker might have discovered many of the same weaknesses and exploited them in another way, but an autonomous agent can test options, repeat actions, and change tactics at machine speed. And I think that's something that needs to be weighed in on.
So this wasn't a model hallucinating, it was a model pursuing an objective. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, very much so. The risk is not that an AI produces the wrong answer. The risk is that it takes the wrong action while pursuing what it believes is the right objective. These are inherent vulnerabilities. They don't exist on their own.
Yeah, and that distinction matters for how you govern it. If the risk was hallucinating, the answer would be better prompts and better model guardrails. But when the risk is an autonomous agent pursuing an objective through your infrastructure, the answer has to be governance, identity, authority, and the controls that work at the speed that agent operates. That is the bridge to the next part of this story.
So there's an interesting contradiction in this story. The offensive activity involved a closed model operating without its normal safeguards, but Hugging Face reportedly relied on an open weight model during parts of the response. Vrinder, can you tell us more about what happened there?
Yeah. So, what has been highlighted during the investigation is that Hugging Face reportedly attempted to use a commercial AI API to analyze the attack. But incident response often requires defenders to inspect the malicious code, understand exploitation methods, and reproduce attacker behavior. That's fundamentals of SecOps. And those activities can look offensive to an AI system or an AI safety system. And so the commercial API guardrails reportedly restricted some of that analysis. As some would say, it fought back. But those were the guardrails. Hugging Face then moved to an open weight model that it could operate locally on its own infrastructure. And here's the thing. Because the team controlled the model and its environment, it could then use the model more freely for the forensic analysis and containment of the issues that were going on.
And Henny, you've been looking at this from the governance side. Is this an argument for open models in enterprise security?
Well, I would reframe that question. The interesting question isn't whether open models are better than closed models, but it's who controls the operating environment during an incident. If the controls that protect that model also prevent defenders from using it during an emergency, then those controls become part of the incident. And that's really the real tension here. They couldn't use the closed model per se because it suffered from the same deficiencies. The closed API failed because it was designed for general-purpose safety. It has all these guardrails and everything. And so the enterprise incident response has a different risk model. And that distinction really matters.
And there's also the other side. The same open models are available to attackers. They may have no provider-enforced refusal mechanisms, which is the equivalent to the kill switch. So a pseudo provider-enforced refusal mechanism and an external kill switch. The open model advantage is not exclusive to the defenders.
Exactly. And Hugging Face has significant infrastructure and technical expertise here. They can run a capable open weight model locally, where most enterprise security teams cannot do that easily. They may just not have the computing capacity or the model expertise or the operating processes required to deploy and secure those systems. So this is kind of the conundrum most enterprises struggle with. They are handcuffed because their management typically would say we need to use these closed models because they're secure. But when you operate in that world, you are handcuffed. So the question is not simply open versus closed. The question is who controls the tools that organization needs when seconds matter.
So Henny, how should enterprises handle that?
They need an operating model for authorized security use. A control should understand more than whether an action looks dangerous. It should understand who is performing the action, what authority they have, and why they are doing it. The goal should not be unrestricted AI. The goal should be controlled capability under a defined authority. We're not saying don't use the closed models and just go. It's the Wild West, and just use open models because that in itself inherently poses risk. But there has to be this duality between these two models and leveraging the best model at the point in time.
So we've been focusing on governance, and I'd like to stay here for a minute. The market has been spending the last 20 years asking the question, who has access? Does AI force us to start asking who can delegate access or who can authorize autonomous action?
That's exactly the right question, Jamie. The short answer is yes. My first point is that most of the underlying weaknesses in this incident were not new. The overly broad access is not new. I mean, we see that today. People have too much access. This is why segregation of duties is important. They have long-lived credentials so passwords don't get forced to be changed. Unsafe processing of untrusted content is not new. Weak segmentation of data, exposed infrastructure, and the slow revocation. All of these things, this is the world we live in. And so enterprises really need to understand that we're not saying that AI is changing all of this. We're saying the change is in the speed at which things are happening. That's really the underlying thing here. None of these failures were novel. Everyone maps to a control that an auditor has been evaluating for years under the SOX program. And all of the various regulatory programs out there, ITGC, cloud security, segregation of duties, NIST, all the different NISTs, ISOs, all of them. The intent with those programs is to reduce risk by enforcing certain controls. What changed here is purely the speed and autonomy of the actor, and many enterprise controls were designed around human operating speed. So it's okay if you catch it this month. But in this AI world, if things happen in milliseconds, you're doomed if you don't catch it at that same speed. Typically, a manager approves something, an administrator provisions it, and a reviewer examines it later. That model is flipped on its head with AI because that no longer works.
So I've heard this term control latency being kicked around a bit in conversations. Is that what is meant by control latency?
Yeah, absolutely. Control latency is literally the time between the risky action and the effective response that has happened. So for instance, imagine an agent starts behaving abnormally at 10 a.m. The monitoring platform creates an alert at 10:05, and an analyst reviews it 20 minutes later. The issue is escalated, and access is finally revoked an hour later. That's our typical traditional process in a fast organization. That may be considered a reasonably fast response in today's world, but when you're talking autonomous agents, an hour is like a lifetime. During that time, a human could only maybe do a handful of transactions. An autonomous agent could do thousands of actions, and that is essentially where the major risk lies.
So if an AI agent can perform thousands of actions before a human can even open a ticket, is the real control no longer preventative controls but automated governance?
I think that is the direction we need to seriously go into. Let me break that down a little bit more. First and foremost, every agent needs a distinct identity. It should not inherit a developer account or rely on some shared service credential. It needs to be auditable. Secondly, organizations need to govern authority, not just access. For years we've asked who has access. Now we also need to ask who delegated that authority, what access can it perform, for how long, and which systems. And also, what's the protocol if things go wrong and we have to revoke it immediately? Thirdly, credentials should be temporary and limited to a specific task at hand. The agent should not receive broad permanent access because it may one day need it. It should literally be purpose-built. And fourth, organizations need continuous monitoring of behavior. An access review may confirm that an agent is permitted to use a system, but it doesn't tell you whether the behavior is appropriate. And then, lastly, the response needs to be automated. So if an agent moves outside of the guardrails and its approved boundaries, the organization should immediately be able to act by limiting privileges and potentially shutting that down.
Frinder.
Yeah, and Henny hits all the nails on the head there. The audit record here becomes critical then. After an incident, the organization needs to reconstruct the full sequence. What objective was the agent given? What model version was used? What tools could it call? Which credentials it used? These audit record items, the what, which, how, who, when, are critical. The time and date stamps and the before and after, these things just become more and more important.
Yeah, exactly, Vrinder. It's no longer enough for an audit log to just show that a service account connected. There needs to be accountability. You need complete chain of custody and authority so that you will know when it started doing what, who defined that objective, who approved it, and what tools it had access to at that given point in time, as well as which policy governed that activity. What did it access? What did it do? You have to have complete chain. And there's a lot of talk around potentially using blockchain for that, because blockchain is an immutable record. The danger with using log files in the old school way that we used to do things is that the AI has a lot of autonomy, and it has a lot of access. And so, if you're just writing to a regular log file, who's to say that the AI isn't going to alter that? But with blockchain, once it's written, it's done. You cannot go in and modify it. You can go and put an amendment in, but it sits on top of the original record. So there's full auditability. That's, I think, where we're going towards.
And in your opinion, does that require a completely new governance framework?
No, I wouldn't say so. I think the principles remain the same. Least privilege still matters, segregation of duties still matters, all of the different regulatory aspects still apply, SOX, NIST, ISO, change management, accountability, and everything else still applies. What needs to change is just how those principles are implemented. Historically, governance has been periodic. It might be okay to catch something during the course of the month, and really no harm. And even in a really fast-paced environment, sometimes an hour is considered okay. But in this new world, when you're talking autonomous systems, that's just not going to work because you require continuous assurance. The organization has to ask themselves, is this identity still authorized and does it still need specific access? If not, it shouldn't have it. Has the behavior changed? Is it consistent with the approved objective? And should a human intervene? These are things that we have to be able to answer in the moment, not afterwards. And I think if you look at the current models, we tend to always after the fact go, okay, well, why did this happen? And we try to work our way back. That is not going to work in this new world. Ooh.
And so does that change the security perimeter in your opinion?
Yeah, I do believe it does. The perimeter has already moved from networks towards identity. We've seen that over the last couple of years. And especially with autonomous agents, the next perimeter is authority. The perimeter isn't disappearing, it's just moving. The structure has changed over time. An agent may use a valid identity or an approved API and maybe a certain specific network connection. But each individual action may look like a legitimate thing. The sequence of the actions may still create an unacceptable outcome. When you're looking at isolated things that it's doing, it's okay. But when you put them together, you end up with something maybe dangerous because of the speed at which it's able to do things. So the most important boundary is therefore not simply whether an agent can enter a system. It is what the agent has the authority to do once it's there.
So let's make this practical for the listeners. Imagine you're reviewing your AI strategy next week. What assumptions should you challenge after hearing this story? Vrinder, let's start with you.
Yeah, assess yourself. By that, I mean, start by identifying where autonomous and semi-autonomous agents are already operating and conduct what I like to term as a self-audit. It has to be a collaborative approach between IT and the business, of course, because sometimes those languages can mean different things. Never the twain shall meet is what comes to mind, but that may include teams from development, cloud ops, security, finance, HR, customer support. These will all have input, at least at this stage, to a greater or lesser degree. And in that self-audit, be as detailed as you can. To that point, there's a lot of frameworks out there which are part of the various regimes that will give you the guidance on how to self-assess yourself. It's only a slight shift. Look at each agent. Who owns it? The 5 Ws again. And then the second action is to review the connectivity. And I think this is one of the most important here. Do not assume anything. Just because they started in your controlled environment, Hugging Face, etc., that it will remain there. Review package managers, APIs, plugins, infrastructure components, shared storage, external web access, metadata services. And then the third action is to examine those credentials. That's why it's important to have this as a cross-functional exercise, because you will uncover areas and blind spots. You need to ensure that where access cannot be revoked quickly simply by the virtue of the way it's just become constructed over time, you need to address that. And then remember, AI did not create the weakness. It makes them easier to exploit at scale.
And Henny, if you were reviewing your AI strategy next week, from the governance perspective, what would you add?
I would definitely begin with an authority mapping. For each important agent, identify what business actions it can perform. Can it read data? Can it create? Can it approve something? Can it change a configuration? Can it modify production data? Can it create another identity and grant access? Kind of essentially opening up the door for another agent to do something while it's doing something else? These are very different levels of risk. Secondly, test the organization's revocation capability. Ask a simple question. If this agent begins acting incorrectly right now, how quickly can we actually stop it? Not how quickly can we open a ticket. That's the old model. Thirdly, establish a minimum evidence standard before an agent enters production. The organization should be able to reconstruct its objective, versions, tools, permissions, actions, and policy decisions. And if you cannot reconstruct what an agent did, it should not be operating in a high-risk business process.
So would you say this is fundamentally an AI security problem, or rather an identity governance problem amplified by AI?
It's really both. AI introduces new issues around autonomy, adaptability, and scale, but an agent can only create enterprise impact through the authority available to it. So the moment an agent receives credentials and access to business systems, it becomes part of that identity and control environment. So AI security cannot be separated from its identity governance, the privileged access and segregation of duties controls that we have in place for changes and transactions.
Frinder,
The model may identify the path, but the organization's control environment determines how far that path goes. A credential matters because it has permissions, and permissions matter because they allow actions. And those actions become dangerous when the organization cannot detect and stop them quick enough. And to Henny's point, it's not about a ticket. Do not focus only on what the AI model can say, focus on what the agent can do. The risk changes when a model has tools, credentials, network access, and memory, and it becomes much more permissive and risky.
and Henny, your final takeaway?
The central question is not simply can we trust the model? It is what authority have we given it? How continuously are we monitoring that authority? How quickly can we revoke it? And can we prove afterwards that every material action was governed? Quarterly reviews and static policies will just not be enough. Organizations will need continuous assurance, machine speed enforcement, and a complete chain of accountability. But I would add one more broader point here. The important lesson isn't that AI became a hacker. The lesson is that software now makes operational decisions independently. Whether the actor is an AI agent, the old-school RPA bots, an autonomous deployment pipeline, governance has to evolve from supervising people to supervising autonomous actors.
Good point. So a year ago, we were asking whether AI could help security teams, and it seems like today we're asking how to govern software that's capable of acting on its own. This incident began as a cybersecurity evaluation. A model was given a goal, found an unexpected path outside its environment, and pursued information that could help it complete that task. The vulnerabilities were familiar: overly broad access, long-lived credentials, unsafe processing, weak segmentation, slow detection, slow revocation. What changed was the speed, adaptability, persistence, and autonomy of the actors. For years, security leaders have asked who has access. The next generation of governance must also ask who or what has the authority to act. That authority must be limited, continuously monitored, rapidly revocable, and fully auditable. Vrinder, Henny, thank you for joining me, and thanks to everyone listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe out there.